We're thrilled to have Professor Deb Roy with us today. And just, I don't know if all you know that xTalk is part of residential education at ODL. And not only by the table with refreshments, there are some handouts that talk a little bit more about the other things that residential education does. So feel free to help yourself to those. So that's pretty much all the business I have to relay. And I'm going to, I've asked my colleague Claudia Araya, who leads the PK Action Group, to introduce Professor Roy this afternoon. So I'll turn over the proceedings to Claudia.
Thank you. And it's PK-12 Action Group, just to clarify.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Deb Roy. I know him for almost 20 years from the Media Lab, so we're good friends, and we were also students at some point at the Media Lab. So Deb is an associate professor from the Media Lab, and he's the head of the, I don't want to say it wrong, Laboratory of Social Machines. So that has changed more recently, and he talked about that. And then he's also the chief media scientist at Twitter. So I know Deb, and he's always done language acquisition work, but some of the work that he's done that you might have heard is is associated with a TED Talk that he gave called The Birth of a Word. So if you haven't seen that, I advise you to do that. But just welcome, Deb, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. So actually, I think one of the first places that Claudia and I actually overlapped was we were both working with Seymour Papert and his group in Thailand. You, of course, deeply. It was sort of my first exposure to some of the ideas that came out of Seymour's group, which continue to influence definitely what we're doing. So thank you all for coming to hear about this work. I'd like to do three things. Spend a couple of minutes and just tell you a little bit about Laboratory for Social Machines. Actually, just give you a flyby one other effort, which has nothing directly to do with children's learning, but it'll give you a sense of the breadth of this new lab, which was established about 3 years ago, based at the Media Lab. And then tell you about some work we've begun in technologies to support early literacy learning. And then sort of the third piece, which will seem kind of seamless, but I just want to flag it up front, is an aspirational sketch of where we think this early work could lead to over the next few years, just to give you a sense of like that larger picture, which is sure to evolve over time. And one of the hopes is, I think we're here till 4 o'clock. I certainly want to stop talking before that so we can get some reactions. And a couple of people from our group are here. So I hope we can kind of get reactions. And if anyone is interested then in helping shape this work, because it's very early stage, we're super open. So Laboratory for Social Machines, this is a slightly doctored, I just realized I grabbed off our web, 2 people who really were at our retreat, but apparently were photoshopped in. This is like one clasping his computer, I realize, even though we're beachfront. But we're a group of now approaching 30 people, so it's a lab that's grown pretty quickly. And there's, in terms of sort of technical areas that most of the graduate students, most but not all, are focused on, is on one hand kind of thinking about social networks and both designing and sort of trying to create new connections between people, which is part of what we're focused on in the learning, and also analyzing existing networks, so sort of social network analytics. And by content, primarily language, but also starting to look at kind of visual content, but building tools to both create new kinds of content and where there's existing content flowing through networks, analyze using machine learning, NLP, and so forth. And then there's areas, kind of domain areas that we've started to build up in. The first area, and now the biggest effort, is around journalism and public engagement, and in particular, analyzing the US elections. So we have a very busy team at the moment. And then the playful learning is, we started about a little over 2 years ago, and is now gaining momentum, and it's what I'll primarily focus on. We're also doing increasing amount of work around food, media, and food behavior. So just to give you a sense of that first area, and this is just to again familiarize you with the the lab. We have now almost 20 people, including some external folks who've just joined for the elections, to analyze this somewhat unusual, let's just say, election. We've been developing NLP tools to analyze at scale how people on Twitter and in mainstream news are actually talking about and reporting on the elections. And this is just an example of doing conversational analysis using new kinds of language processing algorithms, but also just wanted to point out that we partner with outside partners such as the Washington Post to actually publish analyses. We're also doing various kinds of network analysis of, in this case, who is talking about the economy and jobs in the context of the elections, and then starting to use network analysis algorithms to sort of pinpoint structure of who's talking, in this case, polarization, left to right polarization of people talking about the economy, and in the process, developing a kind of library of capabilities that we can reuse for other sorts of network analysis. We build dashboards, so this is a now quite robust interactive way to explore the output of analytics, in this case coming from the elections. And then we spend a fair amount of effort in outreach. So we have several now news publication partners with whom we are helping to co-write and take essentially data and analytics and get it out into the public conversation. And we also partnered with the Commission for Presidential Debates and were asked to generate a brief for each of the moderators of the 3 presidential debates. So the point there is there's quite a bit of work in doing large-scale data analysis, in particular sort of semantic and sort of content analysis of unstructured natural language. We also have expertise in analyzing networks and understanding roles and starting to understand some of the different kind of cocoons or different communities, community networks that exist within the, in this case, Twitter ecosystem. And we take seriously getting the work and the research out into the field. And so we have a pretty sizable group working with partners like, the Commission for Presidential Debates cares a lot about democracy, cares a lot about the debates, doesn't pretend to understand the finer points of machine learning and NLP. And so we have a pretty significant effort in creating that sort of bridge and getting the work out. And that same approach, general approach of technology and then building bridges with partners is what we plan to take around learning. So let me now tell you about what we're doing in learning. And as Claudia mentioned, just for backdrop, I've been at MIT for, I guess, over 20 years. And we've done a lot of work over the years in using data, machine learning analytics to understand how children learn, and sort of the focus on language. And the TED Talk she referred to was an example, kind of one of the major projects in doing observational analysis. So if you have longitudinal rich data to observe a child's learning environment, from that can you infer certain patterns of learning, what some of the effects potentially are of the environment in how a child learns or doesn't learn language skills. What we're doing now is coming back to similar themes, but thinking now not just about observational learning, but actually creating interventions to actually enable new forms of learning. This is now actually quite sizable group. A lot of people have joined recently that are all listed here, some of whom, Amina and Juliana and Annalie and Winston are actually here today. So I wanted to list kind of 3, I'm sure there's more if we kind of wanted to create the complete list of sort of principles that are guiding our approach. But one is certainly very much influenced by growing up in the house that Seymour Papert built in terms of the actual pedagogy of the Media Lab itself, and this idea of both constructionist and constructivist sort of philosophy of learning. And this nice picture I stole from Lego off the web a couple hours ago. So thinking about playful learning, which is child-driven, the learner's interests being key to it being sort of a self-sustaining and motivated, self-motivated kind of learning. So that's kind of one principle. The second is the importance of observation and analysis and doing that systematically. This is Maria Montessori, the Montessori method. The importance of observation and feedback was a key principle. We agree with that. And this is a place where technology can play a role in letting us level up and in various ways have kind of superhuman observation and analytics capabilities. And the third is that learning is inherently social, and especially the younger you go, and our target group right now is, roughly starting around 4 years old, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, sort of looking at that range. But the younger you go, the more mandatory it is to think about the parent. This is obvious once you go, you go down to toddlers and infants. The caregiver is critical. So we think that matters. And as you'll see, as I kind of take you through the kind of emerging plan, we think it's also interesting to think about at least one other person in that loop beyond parent and child. So but the kind of social dimension is very much a focus. So let me now share with you some of the concrete work, and this begins with we want to start somewhere, be very concrete. So Yvonne, one of our PhD students, a little over 2 years ago, started building this this app. It runs on Android, and the goal was to focus on just pick one skill within sort of the kind of collection of skills that lead to kind of fluency in working with the written word, which was the mapping from graphemes to phonemes, or just the sound patterns of English. And to have this idea of kind of playful learning and sort of Lego block kind of look and feel, and create sort of a toy with which we could then start experimenting with in different contexts. So I'm going to play a short video, and I think it'll pretty much speak for itself, but essentially as you touch and manipulate the letters, you have continuous speech telling you what the words spell, or the sounds they make.
Ball. Cat.
So there's a word drawer here where you can take preformed words and drag them out.
Cup.
So you can pull that into the canvas area.
Cupcake.
The system
Cupca.
happily pronounces nonsense words as best as it can. And there's a second drawer with letters.
Cupcake. Cupcake.
It's pretty simple. There's quite a bit of effort put into creating. There's a physics simulator, so the blocks kind of bounce around. There's a sense of static cling, which you can modify, so things tend to stick together. You can pull things apart and so forth. But it turns out very natural. You can hand this to a young child, and the only thing that some kids, or actually even more often adults, don't figure out on their own is you can pull things apart with 2 fingers. Something I won't show, but Yvonne has built this very nice kind of pair of floating hands, which will sometimes come and show you how to do things. And if you reach in while the hands are showing you what to do, they just quickly get out of the way. And if you construct something, sometimes the hand will come in and pull it apart just to show you what happens and put it back together. So there's some prompts that we've started designing to make this really something that, with very little outside support, if you just hand to a kid, they can start playing. So then we worked with Susan Fine, who's a clinical faculty member at Northeastern University, and Annalie and Yvonne worked with Susan to do an initial pilot. And really the main question we're asking the pilot is, does the app work and not crash? Will kids actually use it and sort of continue to remain engaged with the app? What kind of activities or sort of scaffolding do we need to put around this sort of this experience to just keep children engaged, Of course, ultimately we would want to know whether it aids in learning and so forth, but we didn't construct this in a way to get at kind of efficacy of the technology. It was more just let's put it into the hands of kids and get a first sense of what happens. So 16 kids over 10 weeks in this, these are 4 and 5-year-olds at this preschool at Northeastern University. So this is children from Northeastern staff and faculty. So that's sort of the community. The way the classroom was organized, there's a kind of early literacy station, and so they just swapped out their normal materials that they had in that station and dropped in speech blocks. And as you'll see, there's 4 children who would come and, Emily, how long were the sessions? Sort of 30 minutes? 50? 15, 15. So I have 2 short clips just to give you a bit of just the flavor of what happened. You'll notice both Yvonne and Annalie and Susan Fine parked very, very close to the kids. So this was a technology plus human intervention, although they were mainly there to observe. But if someone got stuck or really frustrated, they would actually help get the child unstuck. So this is the very first week. Probably the main thing to notice here, which some people have pointed out to us, is often when you hand a phone to a 5-year-old, it is like a social black hole. It just sucks the kid in, and they just become completely engaged with the device. Here, because there's 4 devices and they're all talking, you'll actually notice a fair amount of social interaction amongst the kids around the technology, and that was something that was consistently we saw throughout the 10 weeks. So one girl reaching over to look at what the other is doing. And there's Susan and Annalie and Yvonne trying to look inconspicuous. Fast forward to week 5. And a couple of things to notice here. One is if you look very carefully on the table, you'll see some cards. So one of the things that Yvonne and Annalie started experimenting with is, well, what do you do as you keep coming back to these speech blocks? What do you actually do with the blocks? And so one of the things that they found turned out to be very effective was to have little printed cards with characters, kind of recognizable characters from sort of popular animations that were prompts to try to write the names of the characters, construct sort of words and phrases that were sort of prompted by these cards. The other thing you'll notice is I think one of the children here refers to sort of what she has written. And so there's a sense of going from just playing around with the blocks to actually to writing. Okay, so as a child is using speech blocks, we're actually capturing very fine-grained data. So this is just showing a little example. Every time you see the fingerprints, that is actually when we registered a touch on the screen, and we have exactly what trajectory over time the finger moved. And so we're getting this raw data at a nice fine granularity. And so then once we had this raw data, we wanted to start to look at it and try to understand if there were kind of repeatable patterns or interpretable patterns. We still, I don't think I've settled on an official name for this, but I've lately been calling them play traces. So the kind of data traces as a child plays. And then from those play traces, can we start to discern certain kinds of higher order units of analysis beyond sort of single touch points. So let me just explain. This is a visualization that Mina and Yvonne developed. Every time you see a new circle, a new node appear, that means a letter, or sometimes it's a whole word, is being dragged out of the letter tray and dropped into the canvas. The vertical axis is time, so we're about a minute into this particular play trace. And you can see, an A was introduced, then an R and a Y. And as we move through time now, you can see that, about a little after 2 minutes in, there is suddenly a burst of activity. And what this merge means is the child has taken, in this case, a pair AM and an I and brought them together. Okay, and if you look over on this column, every time speech blocks talks, we're just capturing what it said. So this is the kind of acoustic experience for the child. The red is indicating where the finger is actually touching the screen. So you can kind of get a shadow of the human activity of where the touch points are. And so here there was a letter E. It's actually removed, leaving the I from IE and the AM, which was constructed earlier. So a bunch of E's that are removed. IAM comes together. Keep going. And a whole construction appears. And at this point, we're now 3 minutes and change in. This weird word, EROM, is settled upon. And then for the next minute, nothing. Just a couple of taps. And this little girl keeps hearing speech blocks say, EROM, EROM. And then we go a little further, and now that is being pulled apart. So you can see, again, from this visualization that that one word is being deconstructed until it's just letters, and then an M and an A comes together. Keep going, and we come to the conclusion of this little story. 6.5 minutes in, she reassembles these letters, almost a mirror image, and that's actually her name. So this is obviously interesting just as an example. There was a little prompt in that kind of minute, which was kind of confusing, and it's like, this is not what I'm trying to get. What's wrong? Why is it saying this weird thing? Either Yvonne or Annalie gave a hint, and then she kind of went through this deconstruction and reconstruction. So it's kind of interesting, just that reversal, which we actually see once in a while in the data. And also just the point that this visualization lets us take this pretty raw feed of data, and in this case, piece together something meaningful, where the meaning is really by looking at sort of these way stations along and some of the speed at which it happens, how long child stays with that unit, and at some point, maybe she's done with it, either recycles it, throws it back into the tray, or leaves it and constructs it, adds other things to it. So you can start to sort of read a kind of language out of these play traces. So imagine if you had play traces from thousands of children longitudinally, and maybe some other indicators of how the child is developing in sort of literacy skills. So just as a kind of a new kind of data. Yeah.
Do you have any insights regarding the children playing with each other that drove new pattern changes of me learning from you or me mixing something we created
Yeah.
that was materially significant?
Yeah.
So the question is, have you seen anything in the data where children are interacting with each other that results in a new play trace, or an expansion or an advancing of the play trace based on that interaction?
Can you hold that question? Because I think it's a key question, and the fact that I claimed we're interested in social learning, that it is actually very important. And I'll also pull in others into the conversation around. But so the short answer is, you can't see it directly in this data because this is just one child and what they're doing on the phone. But we have video from these pilots, and so and even the first clip I showed, that was kind of a point I emphasized. But exactly how it ties into what we see in the traces, we don't know how to look at systematically, but we care deeply about. So it's and you'll see. I'll touch on that in a minute. So this is for a different child. These play traces actually from different sessions where she interacted with speech blocks, and you can sweep across. So that's the entire 10 weeks. And actually, Mina and then Juliana literally printed out these big poster-size place traces, and we're literally walking through the data, or actually crawling over through the data. So I have a great picture. I didn't have time to pull it of Juliana on her, literally crawling over data. But we can start spawning interesting things. Like these are, it turns out, if you know, if you could read this from back there, IEFIF, FFEE. This little girl's name is Effie. These are very early attempts, actually, to spell her name. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and we see better approximations. And actually, if you also just look roughly at the shape of the tree, how fast she is assembling is the vertical extent. Left to right or right to left constructions you can also see from the visualization. So if you go to week 10, this is, we're starting to recognize a kind of signature of a quite practiced hand and having a very clear goal and creating this sort of consistent left to right construction. So it raises the possibility, and we're quite confident we can now make progress on this, on automatically segmenting. You might call this a play tree, to actually segment and identify these higher order units. Understand to what degree it seems to be goal directed and the goal is reached, and also start to characterize some of the sort of the properties of, to what degree is this does this have sort of left to right consistency? To what degree was there a kind of undos in kind of creating this? Nothing wrong, of course, with making mistakes and leaving things. And in fact, we embrace letter combinations that are not sort of legal or properly spelled. The speech box will happily try to pronounce whatever you give it. But meanwhile, we're able to do these sorts of characterizations. We've also built Eric Chu, another student in the group, has built a model that will, for any sequence of words, analyze the sequence and determine to what likelihood it is that the word is targeting an English word. Does this look like a pronounceable word, even if it doesn't exist in any known English dictionary? It looks like the child is trying to spell a real word. Versus sometimes, it's just total garbage, and they're just playing and seeing. And so we have a quite nice, quite robust model for making that kind of classification. So these are just to give you a sense of some of the kinds of analytics. But really, we're already feeling hungry for more data to create sort of models that are grounded in the data. But working with this pilot data, we've started constructing elements of a kind of analytics dashboard. So a person can very quickly pull up and see a child's data historically. In this case, because we have video, where something interesting happens in the play trace, to go and see the actual video and get sort of a qualitative read. We're very interested in sort of children's engagement around. Mm-hmm.
As a background, what kind of instructions are given to
Mm-hmm.
the children at the beginning? I mean, are they asked to kind of, try to figure out your name?
Right.
Or
Yeah.
what kind of,
So it kept evolving over the 10 weeks, but Annalie, do you want to just give a summary of sort of how we...
So we started actually with no instruction. We just kind of said, here's speech blocks. You can play it this way, and then just handed it to them. And then after a couple weeks of that, we tried doing a story element where we read them a story and a couple words were missing, and they could make real or nonsense words, and then that didn't work as well. And then we did the cards that Deb mentioned with the characters, and that actually grew out of the fact that they started discovering that if you put zoo and zoo together, it sounded like Zazu, and they kept talking about characters. So then we decided to bring that element in. And then after that, it was really just, there was really no formal instruction. It was just kind of what, again, very child interest driven, what they expressed interest in, and then how we could kind of cater to that.
Yes. The traveling mic.
Thanks for your cooperation.
When we say child interest driven, I want to put a question mark over there. I have a 7-year-old, and one of the first things that he learned to spell is his name, and then Jedi, for some reason. Star Wars reason, I think. And so my question is, or comment is, how much is this a window into the child's mind rather than how much of it is a window into how we teach kids? Because they already come in, it's not the tabula rasa when they come into the classroom. They already have been taught lots of other things, especially with respect to, as soon as they learn the alphabet, number one thing is how do they spell their names? So it's interesting that a lot of the examples you show are actually them trying to figure out how to write their names, and they come up with that. So,
You know, look, I think that's a great question, and what I think the way I'd characterize speech blocks right now is in terms of being a basis for a learning activity or even a play activity. It's I mean it's an element that could enter into many different kinds of interactions, and depending on to what degree you structure it, you'll get different kinds of activity around it. We consider it in some important ways incomplete, which I'll talk about our ideas for how to have different kind of structuring elements. In terms of your question of are you getting a read of the child's mind or sort of their kind of current skill set versus again, what was the alternative versus something about the environment or the
more about
ourselves, right? Yeah, you know, I think the way to think about speech blocks, in fact, the way we talk about it internally, is it's a medium, and you know, as is speech or as is the written word, it's just a variant of. So it's a kind of digital medium that has some interesting properties. You can instrument it and capture certain kinds of data naturally. And the medium can be used in many different ways, and it'll reflect some combination of both. So I don't think it's one or the other. But if coming from the environment, the kind of structuring activities start to channel the child towards trying to achieve certain goals, and they can't, or you know, versus they can, there may be also very interesting diagnostic properties to seeing what's flowing through the medium, which is, you know, in principle no different than saying, okay, I'm going to create a test, and the medium is here's your pencil and your paper, and let's see what you do, and so in that sense, it's as general purpose, but we're that's okay. Sorry, the screen here changed, but this is still good. So let's, again, maybe some of the things that we're thinking about, kind of how to embed this in a larger system will, I don't think it'll answer your questions, but at least give you a sense of how we're thinking about that. Okay, so if you have a dashboard, where our thinking went next, and something we started to just model out manually is, given, you know, Effie's play traces for 10 weeks, if you just imagine halfway through, you know, on week 5, looking at what she just did and looking at historically what she's done in the past, could we, if we want to give some feedback to her parent, because we're now imagining, we haven't done this yet, but we're thinking about what happens if the app is on the phone at home, and a parent gives the gives the phone to their child and lets them play with this at home. So we don't have the structure of a classroom sort of as the context, and this turns our attention to how do we bring the parent into the loop and potentially give the parent some support in how to, first of all, understand what the child is doing on the, you know, using speech blocks, and potentially give the parent some tips for how to set different kind of activities in motion using speech blocks. So Juliana served as our, we started thinking of this as a, as I said, sort of coaching for parents. This is just an example. The details right now don't matter too much because we know we have a lot of work to do and what kind of tips, but sort of extracting highlights of some new accomplishment that your child has just demonstrated, or maybe some difficulty they're having, some kind of a new combination of letters that they haven't tried before, they just tried, or that we think the child is ready to try with a little bit of encouragement. So these are all examples of both sort of highlighting things that the child has done and then some proactive tips. One thing I haven't mentioned, we have an interest, and we've started, many of our students have started volunteering with 826, which is an after-school reading program in the area, and we're very interested in sort of underprivileged families, and one of the things is we've spent more time both with some of the organizations that work with these communities and just in our internal discussions, is that often the parent, even if they want to be helpful, if they want to support and want to coach the kids, don't know how, maybe don't have that much confidence themselves, may not have strong literacy skills themselves, and we actually think with the right kind of approach to create a kind of support resources for the parent, not only is the parent an ideal person to play that role, but it can actually empower the parent to actually play an active role in learning. So all of that was sort of in our head as Juliana started creating these. And originally the idea was, okay, how do we automate this? How do we create these tips for parents? And I think as soon as we went through this with some real data, the conclusion we came to is, let's right now keep the human in the loop here and think of the analytics, the sort of machine learning analytics, as a kind of power tool for, and this is, remember I said there's a third person we started thinking about as sort of this learning network. So we started referring to this person who right now is, Juliana is our first, and maybe Annalie will be our second, and maybe Mina will be our third coach's coach, that knows how to read this data, put it into historical context of the child, maybe benchmarks with other children, et cetera, but then also use a fair amount of kind of common sense and experience of working with children and working with parents to come up with these sort of tips. And if you now put all the pieces together, here is sort of what we're thinking would be an interesting thing to pilot over the next year with the right partners. So first of all, you have our child learner who's interacting with apps. Our primary concept of this is it's happening sort of in the informal, in-home, sort of outside of school sort of environment. We have the parent as coach, and job number one of parent as coach is if you are going to allow your kid to be on the smartphone at home, steer them away from Candy Crush and Angry Bird and steer them towards our admittedly not as engaging apps, but that's sort of the kind of first ask. As data flows out of this app, and so we have to figure out data sharing arrangements, our coach's coach can now, in a very, we think, sort of efficient way with sort of machine learning power assist tools, kind of understand what's happening through this lens, through the kind of out-of-speech blocks, and feed these tips back. It could happen in face-to-face interactions, but the logistics of that are, it's a high barrier. So it's interesting to use just some kind of communication app, and we actually have plans, sort of mock-ups of what a parent's app looks like, separate from the experience for the child. And then, since we have this coach's coach, it would be interesting to close the loop and say it's not just that you're getting these tips, but you also have a basis to go back to that person. And that creates a very interesting social dimension of bringing in this person as a resource for the parent. And there's no reason to stop there. It's actually possible that that same person could also, in various ways, interact maybe directly with the child, but there's also high-level sort of decisions of ways you might change what's preloaded in that word tray in speech blocks. And you'll notice here, I'm indicating, you might have noticed, a stack of apps, not just one app. But if we had a family of apps, how to graduate to other experiences and kind of change configurations of what that child's experience is the next time they go and open up the app, right? That there's certain decisions where we think it'd be interesting for the same person to be able to steer. So that is that's sort of the picture we've arrived at and are now showing to starting to show slowly to people and get feedback. And meanwhile, with our relationship with A26, but Nabil has just joined the lab recently, also talking to the Boston Public School, and to kind of understand who we might partner with to try to pilot something like this, where right now we think this is clearly a unique role, coach's coach. We're not sure. There's a lot of similar kinds of roles played, for example, professionals who will do interventions in the home and work with both child and parent, but sort of knowing how to use our half-baked tools and invent these sort of this parent support communications on the fly. We'll probably keep that in-house right now as we sort of figure out what works and what doesn't, but really connect this with families in the community. So that's sort of the main picture I want to put on the table. I have a couple of, just to give you trajectories of current work building off of this, to sort of give you a sense of how we're starting to fan out. So let me show you that for about another 5 minutes, and then we take the rest of the time to just for any other kind of questions or reactions you might have. So we're building a Hindi version of speech blocks. So pretty straightforward. In general, other than Japanese and Chinese, where you have a completely non-alphabetic, this method generalizes. So we have a semi-working version of speech of Hindi. We also, and this is work that Annalie and Juliana are doing, is creating a bilingual version. Where if this is in the Spanish zone, it sounds one way, you drag it into English, and it has an English pronunciation, so Jose becomes Joe's. And actually, Juliana, you want to say a word about what motivates the kind of case where you see this being applicable?
Emily and I have been working with kids over at 826 in Roxbury, and a lot of times when they're trying to spell words, we're working with first graders, and we're helping them spell out a word, right? And I'll say something like, oh, okay, the next letter's I, and the kid will write an E. And they're bilingual in English and Spanish, and they're very similar yet very different languages. And so we were noticing that some of the kids would kind of play around with, what would something sound like in another language. So our idea was to build this app in a way that it's not, a translation tool, but it's letting kids tinker with the grapheme-phoneme correspondence in the two different languages and understand how things that might be, similar, but yet different. So like an example being the double L in Spanish that in English doesn't, it exists, but it doesn't mean the same thing, it doesn't sound the same way. Or the fact that the enya exists in Spanish, and then when you drag it over the line, it becomes the N in English, and it's pronounced differently. So helping kids understand those concepts.
A third thing that we're doing, this is Saqib's work, is building physical blocks. And so this is a more radical departure, but again, the same idea of playful learning through blocks, and these are each the size of kind of a large Lego block. We think we can get the cost down to maybe $1 a block, so not super cheap, but not crazy, where the blocks know where their neighbors are. And you can capture play traces now from physical blocks as you sort of play, and what do you embed these blocks in is kind of an open question. So it's sort of in this idea of speech blocks as a medium, this becomes another medium for play that will actually plug into the same kind of analytics and conceptual framework of being able to capture. So this is, we just have a very early prototype working for a handful of blocks, but I think a lot of potential. And finally, the idea of creating nested, sort of a family of apps where you kind of complete speech blocks by saying, well, speech blocks is a way to create text. This is an early sketch of story blocks where you have a sort of storyboarding scaffold, and you can zoom in and take each frame of the story, populate it with some visual elements. When you want to make a character talk, it drops you into speech blocks, and you construct the message in the speech blocks canvas. You swipe back into the story blocks, and that piece of text becomes a caption, which you can then hear. Also the ability to add speech narrations. So it's a concept, and we're probably going to tune the design of this and build this. It'll be the first example of an app that embeds speech blocks as the medium. And that opens up the idea that, well, if you want a kind of to cover various types of activities that will kind of give you the equivalent of a complete curriculum around literacy development, that we can, if we make things that are speech blocks compatible, then we can capture the data in a consistent way from a family of apps. So having this story blocks, you'll notice here, I won't go into too much detail, but there's a face of, in this case, the child who wrote this story, and the presence of other children within the same app experience. So it starts to bring a kind of social dimension. So we, of course, did observe a lot of social interaction in that first pilot. And our interest is to start wherever there's natural kinds of sharing happening, or sort of co-learning. How do we create a digital version extension of that same interaction? So this being an example, this more developed, going beyond single words to having stories. Now you have the possibility of, two children having a basis to connect with each other through the app. I think something that we believe strongly in is this is not going to work if it's pure digital. There needs to be some place where these children actually sometimes interact in person and know each other. Ditto with the coach's coach interacting with the parent. But the ability of using technology to then take a relationship and extend it, right, and is sort of the way we're thinking. And so we sort of call these community learning networks. This is my last slide, and I just sort of wrote down four areas where we're heading off. One is to develop a family of learning apps, and there are just we're throwing around ideas. If anyone has ideas on this, we're open. We think there's a little bit of hackathon fatigue just in general in the world, but there may be variants of that are a little bit deeper engagement with outside developers. But we think we can get to a stage where we have some established pilot and sort of community relationships. The idea that someone could come and, with a few days or a few weeks of effort, write an app that embeds speech blocks and can tie into our framework and be deployed into and be put into the hands of some kids, it could be a pretty interesting context to bring in some talented developers and say, hey, there's like a real kind of social impact element to what you could do if you could build an app around this. And by making it compatible with our stack, sort of enlarge. We don't, in other words, expect to build all the relevant apps ourselves. So that's something we want to figure out. I have a 9 and 11-year-old. When I hand speech blocks even to my 9-year-old, she very quickly is like, great, but where's the keyboard? It's cool, I can hear new sounds and so forth, but when I say, imagine if you are sort of mentoring or coaching a 4-year-old, she's like, yes, that sounds like fun, but where's the keyboard? So that led to, well, maybe that letter tray where you have to drag the letters out individually, if it was reorganized as a QWERTY, and at some point you don't have to drag it, you just touch and the letter appears. And so in other words, transition into a keyboard. So we some pretty straightforward ways for the input to go from blocks to keyboard and the output to go from this printed block, which is already now font in our lab, to slowly fading out the color and just transitioning from blocks to print. So we see speech blocks as being an on-ramp to more sort of traditional and mainstream text I/O. That's important as we go to older kids. We are looking for the right partner. We don't want to try to go meet parents and kids directly ourselves. We want to work with a trusted partner who already has those relationships and who sort of gets where we're trying to go, and we want to actually design this pilot together. Our lab is called Lab for Social Machines. So that picture was a picture of what we mean by a social machine, where there's technology components and people, each playing a different role, and as a system, achieving some task, in this case, learning outcomes, literacy learning outcomes for the child. If we do successfully launch sort of V1 of this social learning machine, we expect as the volume of data increases that's coming in, that a lot of the sort of network and content analytics capabilities that we have developed for other purposes, semantic analysis, phrase level and narrative structure analysis of stories children are reading. There's a lot of, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, incredible things you can do with state-of-the-art AI and machine learning methods, and so we plan to sort of bring those in to analyze the content that's flowing. Imagine even a, I don't know, modest scale pilot, if you have tens of families, or maybe even hundreds of families, if the ask is not that great for downloading the app and using it. Which coach's coach is the best match for which parent? Well, as you see network interactions, I have a role at Twitter, so there's incredible ability to analyze network level dynamics and actually perhaps optimize for which parent, which style of coaching is appropriate, and do kinds of basically social engineering of these sort of matchmaking that would be very, very difficult to do purely manually. So we think if we can get this off the ground and get sort of across a certain threshold for richness of data, there's a whole kind of layer of more advanced analytics techniques that can start a flywheel turning. So I failed to leave 10 minutes. We have 3, but so thank you. That's everything.
Have you had any feedback on everything being uppercase?
Oh, interesting. Have we?
We actually haven't had feedback at all from teachers or parents or anyone, but we've had a little feedback from the kids. And there was a lot of interesting things. So when they would see words in their environment and want to copy them, they were curious how to spell it because some of them hadn't made that connection yet between uppercase and lowercase. Originally in our design, I think we started it because it was just we wanted to choose one case rather than trying to switch between the two. But it's still something that we keep coming back to. So the kids have noticed it. Some kids have noticed it, but it hasn't been a huge deal yet. But it's something that we're kind of looking into as well, especially if we move towards the keyboard.
Yeah.
I think.
Hi, this may be further afield than you want to go, but you mentioned possibly work with older kids in the future. I'm wondering if you obviously have experience in higher education, so do you see any connections to teaching and learning in colleges, either on the analytics side, or obviously like basic literacy isn't a big challenge, although maybe it is, but I'm thinking especially a place like MIT, what should we listen to around your project and thinking of future trends?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that one of our initial forays into learning was we started some work in India, in rural India, with and ran a pilot actually over the last spring, and these were women from their 20s to their 40s who were not just low literacy, but zero literacy, never gone to school, and we weren't testing speech logs, we were doing something different. But actually the reason we started developing a Hindi version is to think about the same technology for adults. I mean, there are some, I think, design principles here, or sort of ideas that sort of map over. But where we're assuming here there's a kind of play-driven dynamic, if you're 30 and you have 4 children and you're, on the farm, farming for 10 hours a day, you have to kind of look differently at the incentives and where the opportunities are. But we think there are many. I don't think that's quite your question, but at least in terms of the direct relevancy of what we're doing to adults, there are many people around the world, including in cities around America where you have adults with low or no literacy. So I think there's a sort of set of links there. I think in terms of within our context closer to home, I'd have to maybe rise to a more abstract, like talk pedagogy or philosophy, which is probably not what you're looking for. But there's certainly links at that level.
I think we've run out of time.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Professor Roy.
All right, thank you.